So as I mentioned in the introductory little video to this lecture, film serves as both an instrument of social criticism and a vehicle for presenting favorable representations of an alternative value system and institutions, showing a new system in Hollywood known as New Hollywood, as is remembered today. So New Hollywood is an alternative counter-revolution, if you will. It's a counter-revolution in film to show a counter of ideas, a counter of values that's different than what was in the 1950s, different than what we saw with Casablanca in the 1940s, and movies coming out like The Graduate, Bonnie and Clyde, Midnight Cowboy, Easy Rider, our movie Harold and Maude that we're going to watch next week, and so many other ones that there's a lot of similarities in them all. And we're going to look at that in this little lecture here. We're going to look at that through the readings in chapter 21. And it's all going to tie together to show how New Hollywood and the direction in Hollywood and the direction of the United States and its culture works together. These films were important not only for the social context, but also subverted the traditional narrative. And the precious filmmakers before, they held those values dear, but now these new filmmakers are coming into Hollywood showing something radically different. In a lot of ways, we can kind of call it as the antithesis of Casablanca. So you just finished watching and turning in Casablanca, but and looking at the values of what was coming out. This is the antithesis of that. This is the other side of the coin. This is the other side of the coin of values in America, showing something completely different in a lot of ways, but still looking at and loving America, but in a different way, perhaps. Interesting thing we can talk about in discussion. But the films of New Hollywood provided audiences with a new set of representations for constructing the world around them. New thoughts, new feelings, new music, new ways of looking at romance, new ways of looking at social realities, what realities are. Maybe that were suppressed in film, that were censored in film, but now bringing right in front of the limelight to show it loud and clear. This is what culture is. This is what individuals are going through. And how do we deal with that in film? How can we look at it in film and then have those hard conversations about real life things, real life issues? And that's what's happening here. A new age of film emerged amongst the chaos of the time. If you saw anything in that image montage I made, you see chaos. In the 60s, just like today, there's an era of chaos. There's things that happen that people don't know how to deal with. It creates anxieties you don't know what to do with. And film and movies is an escape, right? It's an entertainment. We go there to veg out. But it's also to say, hey, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. It's okay to have those thoughts. It's okay to have those feelings. Let's deal with it together. Let's watch this, understand it, and maybe not understand it, but have a conversation of how we can get through it. And you see that time and time again with the films of New Hollywood. Another interesting aspect, even though the social movements themselves could be repressed, censored on the news, or people blasted away with those water cannons, or attacked by dogs, or the collective new social figures, these new people, these new social figures of the time, the protester, the rebel standing up against the man. You hear that word, fight against the man. Those sort of new images of what that is, the very American idea, representing a new type of individual, a new person against the conservative authority of the time, against the social conformity of the time, a new image that lasts and is seen in audiences today, for better or for worse, of course, or for whatever you may think. That image and the memory of what was happening in the 60s, it plays out a lot. Whether you're for or against the presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, a lot of what his mindset was and what he was talking about and going off of in his talks was these images in memory of the 1960s, the images in memory of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he was a part of, and trying to get the young fervor, the young support to attach to that memory of, even though they weren't there, but it's attached to the memory of what the ideal was of this social protester fighting against the man. All those images is put into a presidential campaign. A very interesting thing. So it shows the memory of the 1960s. We're going to look at it in the time that it was created. We're going to go back in time, if you will, to be able to look at the films it was made then and see what the audience were thinking then. And with our own context, how much it carries into today. An interesting thing. It's what we do. That's the pattern for our whole class, but here we get to look at it a little differently. Now, whether it's in film or music or images or writing and novels and skits and plays, what you get in the 1960s is a lot of views looking at the establishment and conservative ideas as an outdated model, as an idea that the police are the enemy, as an idea that the values that they fought for in World War II, that the people who were there in the 1950s don't have the interests anymore of the people of the 60s, that they are being subjugated too long, and to break free of that, that the authority is not to protect them but is against them, that there's a patriarchal family value system that represses women rather than creates security and unity. Does it sound familiar? These are things that we hear about in the news today. Here's things that you see on Facebook all over the place, or Twitter, or whatever. And this is where it emerges. You really get this emerging out of the 1960s and 70s. Also, the idea of government being the slave of the economic interests. Does that ring a bell? Let me say that again. The idea that government is run by economic interests, that government is run by Wall Street, that government is run by big business. This is something that in the United States happens in the late 1800s, carries all the way through, but again emerges its head again in the 60s and 70s and saying the government doesn't have your interests, the military doesn't have the interests of the American people, that the people in politics don't have the interests of the American people, and people fight against it. People are using rhetoric to fight against this idea that U.S. foreign policies are not the liberators they were in Casablanca. They weren't the liberators in the 1940s as they were. They're now a neo-imperialistic monster of the Cold War. So you get people who on one side are fearful of communism, fearful of the Reds, right? The Soviets, or Cuba, with the Cuban Missile Crisis that just happened a little bit before. There's that fear. But on the same side, there's this fear that the U.S. is the aggressors, that U.S. is the neo-imperialists creating havoc. And so you see this horrific way of treating vets coming back from the war of Vietnam, but because they're lashing out at the government, but they can't attack the government itself, but they attack the players of the government, the soldiers. So you see this attack everywhere, and you see it's rearing its ugly head in different ways. You get this idea that the heroes in the struggles are in the third world rather than in the United States. So you get the Che Guevara, if you know Che, the hero of the revolutionary. If you've seen the movie Motorcycle Diaries, talks about his in the South America. Huge image around the world even today as the person fighting for and fighting against the imperialistic endeavors of the West. So, but you see that in the 60s and 70s. You see that in music. You see the mysticism found in drug use, that there's a mystic use of drugs, there's a use of sexuality, using your body as a tool, really, for a rich terrain of different possibilities, rather than an evil to be repressed, as something to hide away, but is to be to celebrate. So you have a celebration of drug culture, a celebration of sexuality and in all its different forms, a fight against what it means to be straight, and so you get a lot of different sexuality imagery and actions coming about in the 60s and 70s. Not with everybody, of course, but this is stuff that's emerging in some subcultures in this time period. And within 60s and 70s in New Hollywood, you see that coming out. You see how they're playing with sexuality. You see how they're changing the norms of looking at relationships, how they're looking at sex itself, how they're looking at sobriety, and the use of drugs and use of alcohol. That all plays central role in New Hollywood. So one movie in particular that definitely shows the use of sexuality, but also against the norm, right? The cultural norm. And we all have it today, don't we? That you go to school, you go to high school, then afterwards you're supposed to go get a job or go to college, go to university. And then after college, university, you should have your plan. People ask you all the time, what are you majoring in? What do you want to do with yourself? What do you want to do with life? And so that you have this strict sort of ladder of life that you go through. The movie The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman, with music played by Simon and Garfunkel, you're going to recognize the music in this clip. And the idea that here's this man who's just very young, graduating college, going through as he's supposed to, in a high middle class life, and he doesn't have a clue what to do with himself. But everyone around him is trying to get him to play the norm, play the role, and get a job, get a career, settle down, have a family, get a house with a picket fence and that whole thing. But he doesn't. That's creating anxiety. That's alienating him. He doesn't believe with that, and he gets a relationship with a married woman. You don't see that in Casablanca. Well, you do, but they hide it pretty well. This is right in your face, and also gets involved with her daughter. So you get this interesting love triangle thing going on. You get this interesting anxiety of what to do with your life after you graduate. You get this anxiety of what the family thinks of him, what other people around him think of him. So check out this clip that introduces the very famous movie, The Graduate.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you.
Listen, everybody, I want you all to be quiet. I've got Ben's college yearbook here, and I just want to read you some of the wonderful things about Ben.
Hey, there's the award-winning scholar.
We're all very proud of you, Ben.
How are you, track star?
What are you going to do now?
I was going to go upstairs for a minute.
Oh, I mean, with your future, your life.
Well, that's a little hard to say.
Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. Aren't you?
Have you gotten to the room yet?
I haven't, no.
Do you want to? I'll get undressed now. Is that all right?
Sure. Shall I just stand here? I don't know what you want me to do.
Why don't you watch?
Oh, sure, thank you.
Benjamin, are you having an affair with someone?
Ha!
I do think you should know the consequences of what you've done. I do think you should know that my wife and I are getting divorced soon.
What happened between Mrs. Robinson and me was nothing. It didn't mean anything.
Well, that's not saying much for my wife.
The point is, I don't love your wife, I love your daughter, sir.
Are you going to Scarborough Fair?
I want to ask you a question, and then I'm going.
From them.
No, I want to know why you're here in Berkeley. Is it because I'm here?
Well, look, I love you.
Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme.
Am I getting married tomorrow?
Why don't you just drag me off if you want to marry me so much?
You can't stop me from seeing her, Mrs. Robinson. I'll find her.
Sorry we won't be able to invite you to the wedding, Benjamin, but the arrangements have been so rushed.
Oh, jeez, Mr. Todd. No.
The Graduate is seen as one of the first films depicting alienation of the era. It rejects his parent upper-class career track, his affair with a married woman, and also her daughter, disruptions in the institution of marriage, where he disrupts the actual wedding ceremony. So that's the institution itself, and he's disrupting that and trying to break that down. And one of the most famous scenes is when he's falling in the water. He's being sort of claustrophobic by society, but he's also able to look from the outside into the culture from afar. It's a very interesting look at claustrophobia of the bourgeois society, claustrophobia of the high middle class, and how that's just gripping him and feels like it's killing him, feels like it's suffocating him, like the pool that he jumps into and looks into. The Graduate is a key alienation film, also the biggest box office hit of the late 1960s, and skyrocketed the career not only of Dustin Hoffman, but also the band Simon & Garfunkel, which of course Disturbed remade Sound of Silence from.